Hi, everyone. Welcome to a deep dive into FRAC's Afterschool Nutrition Report, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center. I'm Steve Hayward, Communications Manager at FRAC. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 30 minutes. We're recording the presentation and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email. Closed captioning is available. To turn captions on, select Show Captions in the bottom taskbar and choose English as the spoken language. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the Q&A tab in the bottom taskbar. With that, I'll pass it off to Clarissa Hayes, Deputy Director of School and Out-of-School Time Programs at FRAC. Take it away, Clarissa.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy afternoon to join us. Like Steve mentioned, we are very excited today to be doing a 30-minute deep dive into FRAC's new report, which was just released earlier this week, which is looking at participation in the after-school nutrition programs. And this report, like our previous reports, looks at participation in after-school suppers and snacks in every state and nationwide, with a very specific focus on supper participation. And this is looking at October 2022, so last October compared to the previous October 2021. So as communities continue to recover from the impact of the pandemic, after-school meals are more important than ever. We know that these key programs help to reduce food insecurity during the hours after school by providing free snacks and suppers to children 18 and under at sites in low-income communities. The other key part of these programs is that they do provide overall operation support to schools, meal sponsors, and after-school programs by providing reimbursement for meals and snacks served at eligible sites. And last but not least, we know that these programs ensure children have the nutrition they need to stay engaged in after-school programming, especially as we know that some schools serve lunch as early as 10 a.m. So this conversation is especially timely today because it is actually Lights On After School, which is a celebration hosted by the After School Alliance that looks at the important role of after-school enrichment programs, which we know provides a really important foundation for suppers and snacks to be served. So as participation in after-school suppers dropped for the first time since the program became available nationwide in 2010, we know that there is an important opportunity moving forward to re-energize and help regain momentum around these important programs. So we do have 30 minutes together to dig into the report, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so for today's agenda, I'm going to start with a very brief overview of the programs, just so you know what programs we'll be talking about in the report. I'll talk a little bit about FRAC's methodology for the report and how we got the data and what we do with the data. And then we'll really dive into the report findings, which I know is what everyone is really excited about. And then we'll end with some recommendations that we outline in the report as far as policy and programmatic opportunities go. We'll end with a few FRAC resources, and then I definitely want to save time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have any questions as we go through, feel free to add them to that box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll make sure to get to those at the end of the webinar. All right, next slide. So like I mentioned at the start, this report does look at participation in both suppers and snacks, but the main measure and the main thing that we're looking at in this report is suppers, because we believe that if possible, sites should try to serve suppers so that children have the nutrition that they need to remain engaged and healthy during the after-school hours. So in the report, we're looking at two main programs, and I won't go too in depth in here. We do have a webinar that dives into what these programs do and how they look different, but I just wanted to set the scene for what we're looking at in the report. So NSLP Snacks is one program that we look at in the report, and this is only a program option for school food authorities that are operating NSLP. So they only receive reimbursement for the snacks served after school on school days only, and only snacks can be served through this program. The other program that we look at in this report is the CACFP After School Meal Program, and this is a program that's open to a broader range of operators. So it includes schools, nonprofit organizations, public institutions, and childcare centers. So unlike just NSLP snacks, reimbursement can happen on school days, and then it can also be drawn down on weekends and on holidays during the school year. And unlike NSLP snacks, through the CACFP After School Meal Program, you can serve up to a supper and a snack. So again, this is the main program that we do look at in our report. So next slide, please. All right, so this is probably too in the weeds, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about our methodology and where we get our data from for this report. So we always get our data from USDA, and what we do is we allow states a chance to update or change their data, so we make sure that the most accurate data is going into the report as possible. And the main year of participation in this report is last October, so October 2022. And the data that we're looking at is the total number of suppers and snacks served through CACFP, the total number of snacks served through NSLP snacks. We also received the total number of lunches served through NSLP. And I know you may be asking, why are we looking at lunches if this is a after-school meal report? Well, in FRAC's reports, we do compare participation in after-school suppers to NSLP lunches because we think that that is a good benchmark for where we want to be with after-school suppers. The other key component that we include in this report is the number of sponsors and sites that were operating in the specific month and year, so in October 2022. So how we find our average daily participation is pretty straightforward. We actually take those numbers of suppers and snacks that I outlined earlier that we get from USDA, and we divide it by the number of school lunch service days in that specific month that we're looking at. The other key data components that you'll see in the report is that we do set a participation goal for every state. So FRAC's goal is that for every 100 children receiving a school lunch during the school year, or every child receiving a free or reduced price school lunch, that we would be reaching at least 15 children with an after-school supper. And then the last component that we look at in the report is missed reimbursement. So we want to see how much federal funding is being left on the table by states not optimizing participation in this program. So we show how much federal funding would be drawn down if states were to meet that 15 per 100 goal that I just outlined. All right, next slide, please. So let's go ahead and jump into the key findings. And I have this separated by different components of the report. So we're going to go ahead and start with suppers, which again is the main focus of this report. And what we found is that in October 2022, just over 1.15 million children received an after-school supper on an average day. And this was actually a drop from the year before. So after-school suppers were serving around 339,000 fewer children when compared to October 2021, and that's about a 23% drop. So one thing that I do want to flag is that supper participation was maintained and even slightly increased during the pandemic, with 1.45 million children being served in October 2020 and 1.49 million children being served in October 2021. So if you are familiar with the other child nutrition programs, summer meals had a pretty sizable increase during the pandemic, as did school meals in some states, but after school meals remain pretty steady. So we only saw a 2% increase in 2020 and a 3% increase in 2021. So it was able to maintain that momentum, but it did not see the same growth that other programs did. So what are we looking at as far as the reach when compared to school lunch? So in October 2022, we know that 6 children received an after-school supper for every 100 that received a free or reduced price school lunch. So on a national level, we did not meet that benchmark of 15 per 100 that I outlined on the earlier slide. Next slide, please. So the next component that we're going to talk about is snacks, because although it's not the main focus, it's definitely still a really critical component and nutrition resource when the school day ends. So participation in after-school snacks was pretty close to after-school suppers. What our report finds is that through the after-school snack programs, which includes both NSLP snacks and snacks served through CACFP, just over 1.19 million children on an average weekday were being reached with a snack. A really interesting thing that we found in our report is that participation overall in the snack programs decreased by just over 200,000 children, but the drop in participation was seen only in CACFP snacks. So that had a drop of around 446,000 fewer children, and NSLP snacks actually increased by just over 214,000 children, but that increase wasn't enough to make up for that drop seen on the CACFP side. So schools who are serving snacks were able to maintain or even grow that participation, but sponsors who were serving CACFP snacks did see that decrease on their side. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about sites. And again, when we're looking at sites, we are looking at CACFP supper sites. And what we found is that just over 38,000 after-school programs participated in the after-school nutrition programs in October 2022, with participation higher in CACFP compared to NSLP. And I'll take back what I just said. So we are looking at both CACFP and NSLP when we're looking at sites. So as you can see, even though there was a drop on the side of CACFP, there were still more sites serving those meals. There was a 20% decrease in the number of CACFP sites in October 2022 compared to October 2021, and there was a slight increase of around 2% or 377 sites in NSLP during those same years. All right, so let's talk about what we saw on this in the States. And I just want to flag that I did put in the chat our storytelling page about this report, and you can go ahead and follow along the tables if you'd like to. And if you want to see your own state's participation, that's where you'll find that information. But what we found is that even with the decrease, 33 states actually moved in the right direction and increased their participation rate in after-school suppers. And 9 of those states actually increased by more than 30%. On the other side of that, we saw that 17 states saw a decrease in supper participation, and all but 3 states dropped by more than 10%. So what we are seeing is that even though fewer states did have that drop, they were having more sizable drops that really impacted the national average. So we know that 5 states reached combined nearly 400,000 fewer children with an after-school supper in October 2022 compared to October 2021, which really mirrored the national decrease in participation, also, although slightly higher. So the decrease, as I mentioned earlier, was 339,000, and that drop across the 5 biggest states with decreases was 400,000 fewer children. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned at the top of the webinar, but one thing that we pull out in our report is what we call missed opportunities, and we really want to see how much federal funding and how many additional children would be reached if states were reaching that goal of 15 children with an after-school supper for every 100 that received a free or reduced price school lunch on the same day. And what we found is that if states were meeting that goal, 1.6 million additional children would have been served an after-school supper, and states would have drawn down an additional $116.5 million during October 2022. All right, so I have a few visuals here that I'd like to walk through. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a look at CACFP supper average daily participation, and this is from 2015 to 2022. So we are looking at 7 years of participation. And as you can see from 2015, we do have pretty consistent participation growth up until 2021 to 2022, where we do see that decrease in participation. So even though we did see an increase year over year, from around October 2019 to 2021, participation had begun to plateau quite a bit. So the growth wasn't as sizable as it had been in earlier years. And just a reminder that after-school suppers have only been available nationwide since 2010. So there are around 5 years of data that's not shown here, but this shows a pretty good look at how participation has slowly and steadily been expanding until we get to 2022, last October. All right, next slide, please. So the next slide here shows a breakdown of the number of suppers and snacks served, and we are looking at 4 years of participation, so October 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. CACFP snacks are in the beautiful yellow color, NSLP snacks are in the teal, and then CACFP suppers are in the blue. And what you can really see here is what I mentioned earlier about how even though CACFP snacks had a decrease from 21 to 22 NSLP snacks, which means schools were choosing to serve more snacks, or they were switching from CACFP snacks to NSLP snacks. So I think this shows a good visual of how the programs kind of switched around over the years of the pandemic, and you can see where the current levels stand. So again, this is a breakdown of meals served by the type of meal component. And I'll give maybe folks 10 more seconds to take a look at this. And we will be sending out the slides and the recording afterwards. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this again is looking at 4 years of participation, and what we're looking at here is the change in CACFP and NSLP sites. So again, you can see from 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. And what we're seeing here is that between 21 and 22, there was a decrease in CACFP sites. There was a slight increase in NSLP sites, but it is so small you can't even really see it on this graph, but there was a slight 2% increase in NSLP snacks or sites. So I'll give folks around 5 more seconds to take a look at this. All right, next slide, please. So let's get into why we think there was a drop. So one key component of this is that beginning in the 22 to 23 school year, the nationwide waivers that have been in place since the pandemic started were no longer an option. So they had expired. So October 2022 is the first year in 3 years where no waivers were available. And as part of this report, we talked to many state agencies, and we know that the area eligibility waiver specifically caused a lot of areas to no longer be eligible to operate, and that could have lended itself to more sites dropping off the program, especially when it comes to CACFP. On the other side of that, we know that many after-school programs and meal sponsors were facing staffing shortages, and that some after-school programs, which I mentioned earlier, really are the foundation we need to serve meals, because you do need to have some kind of enrichment or educational component in order to serve these meals, really either stopped operating or had to limit their capacity and enrollment because of those staffing concerns, safety concerns, other challenges that they were facing. So it is possible from this data, seeing the shift to NSLP, that schools may have decided to shift from CACFP suppers and snacks to NSLP snacks as they dealt with the school meals waivers expiring, because NSLP snacks is more of a extension of their already NSLP operations. But that is one guess we have for why that NSLP participation increased while CACFP did not. All right, next slide, please. So what are some of the opportunities that we see on both the policy and programmatic levels? So let's start with policy. So last year, we got as close as we have been in many years to a child nutrition reauthorization. And for those who are newer to the nutrition programs, this is an opportunity that should happen every 5 years for Congress to take a look at the federal nutrition programs to make changes to them. We have not actually had one of those since 2010, and that was the same legislation that actually gave us Afterschool Suppers as a nationwide program. So we have been working with sponsors and partners to identify what are some of those changes that would really make a difference for CACFP and schools that are operating NSLP snacks. One thing that we've identified is streamlining summer and after school meals. So these sponsors oftentimes serve the same group of children at the same sites, but they have to serve or operate 2 different programs with very different sets of paperwork. So streamlining these programs into one program could really reduce some of that administrative burden that sponsors and schools face. The other piece that we wanted to lift up is the need to lower that area eligibility threshold. So like I mentioned earlier, that was a waiver during the pandemic where sponsors and schools could have sites in any area. It did not have to be at that usual 50% eligibility threshold. And we know that made a huge difference for those sites that may just be right on the border of that 50%, be serving low-income children, but are not eligible through the area eligibility threshold. So we believe that that could really bring in more sites and therefore increase access. One other key opportunity that we've identified is allowing schools, instead of having to switch to CACFP to serve suppers, make it an option for them to serve those same suppers through NSLP, which they're already operating and sometimes doing snacks through that program. And then the other policy recommendation, which isn't exactly aligned on the nutrition side, but we think is really important, is to increase funding for after-school programs. So through our work with the Afterschool Alliance, we know that there are just not enough after-school programs to meet the need and that many children are waiting to get into after-school programs. We know that if we increase the number of after-school programs that are operating, we create more sites and more access points for children to get suppers and snacks. Next slide. All right, and this just builds off that last point I made around expanding those out-of-school time programs. So through the American Rescue Plan, there actually was a historic level of funding that was allocated to support after-school and summer programs. There is still funding on the table in many states to support those same programs, and states are not drawing that all down. So there's a really key opportunity, even if you specifically work on the nutrition programs, to make sure that your education partners and your out-of-school time partners know how important this link is and that more funding is being allocated to support staffing and everything great that after-school programs do. So if you're at all interested, I would highly recommend checking out afterschoolalliance.org to learn more about the advocacy that they are doing on this side. All right, next slide, please. All right, so in addition to programmatic opportunities, policy opportunities, we also believe that there are many things that we can be doing on the state and local level. And like I mentioned earlier, even though after-school meal participation has been growing steadily, it was beginning to plateau before the pandemic, which means that we're potentially, we've gotten those low-hanging fruit. We need to get more programs and more schools interested and aware of this program. So one opportunity that we see is allocating state funding to support after-school meal sponsors and sites. So in some states, there is funding set aside to support summer meal sponsors, whether that be, startup costs or supporting new sponsors. So having that opportunity also be available for after-school meal sponsors could really be helpful. We also think that schools, as they do in every program, play such an important role. And we can tell from the data showing that more schools are choosing to do NSLP snacks, that they may be shifting from doing suppers. And we think that doing suppers, like I mentioned earlier, is really important because we want to make sure that children have all the nutrition that they can get in the after-school hours. So for advocates partnering and supporting your school districts, for other state partners, figuring out what are the barriers and how we can support schools in doing CACFP. And then this aligns very closely with that, but serving suppers instead of or in addition to snacks through CACFP, like I mentioned earlier, you can serve up to a supper and a snack. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing and leveraging the opportunities within that program. And then, as always, with all of the programs, there's always an opportunity to improve meal quality and appeal. There could be a program there, and if the kids aren't enjoying the meals and don't want to go back to the site, we won't see the participation growth that we want to see. So there are efforts to do surveys, do taste tests. I know there's a growing movement around farm to after school, like there is for farm to summer. So there are always ways to make sure that these meals are as delicious and appealing to the children that we want to reach. All right, next slide, please. So I know that was a lot and I see some questions coming in, but before I get to that, I just want to flag that the report is linked here and we'll make sure that everyone gets that. It's also in the chat if you missed that. And then I want to give a plug for some of our FRAC resources. So at our website, if you go to programs and after school nutrition programs, you'll see all of the guides, the fact sheets, the program models, everything else that we have on this program. Highly recommend checking that out. We also have the reports from previous years if you'd like to see how your state has done in previous years. All right. So that is my email address. If you have any questions after we wrap up today and you want to follow up with me, please do. I will also say that here at FRAC, we are very excited about after school meals. We're very committed to this program, and we're looking forward to working with sponsors and schools to see how we can best support. So if you want to reach out and just connect and brainstorm, I'm very happy to do that. All right, so let's go ahead to questions. So the first question I see is, what are some of the main reasons for why sponsor sites drop CACFP supper and or snack? So I outlined that a little bit on a previous slide, and maybe Steve, if you could go back to the why there was a drop slide. But we believe, again, that there was a drop because of the waivers going away and just having to revert back to normal operations after not having to do that the same way for 3 years because of the pandemic waivers. We also know that schools, were coming back and having to start having families fill out the applications, and they weren't able to any longer serve meals at no charge to all students. So it's possible that they chose, to make it easy and go back to doing NSLP snacks rather than having to operate this other program. And then I think really the main thing is just the issues around staffing on both the school sponsor level and then also on the after school program side. We know that capacity was limited, that, some had to shut their door and they just weren't really able to recover even after the pandemic has, the impacts of the pandemic have lessened. And then someone had a question about seeing 5 states with such a high decrease in youth served. Does that indicate the national reduction in suppers and snacks served was mostly concentrated in a handful of states? And yes, that is exactly what that means. I don't know if this question came in before the slide about state momentum, but we did have 33 states that increased participation and 17 that dropped. And the drops were just very sizable. And we did connect with quite a few of those states that had those big drops, and they really outlined a lot of the things that I just mentioned around capacity and staffing. All right, are there any tools to easily see if my site qualifies for CACFP at risk? So the thing about CACFP at risk is it's a little bit not tricky, but you can't use census data, so you can't plug in your address into a map easily to see if you're eligible. It is based off of school data and being in the attendance area of a specific school that's eligible for CACFP after school meals. So if you are confused about that and eligibility, I'd be happy to connect with you, but it is mostly either connecting with your schools in your area or your state agency should also be able to help make sure that you're in an eligible area. All right, so does the report look at CACFP snacks and suppers served on holidays and weekends? So yes, we look at the total number of CACFP suppers. So it is possible that some of those suppers were served and snacks were served on the weekend. There's no easy way to pull that out, but we do have data on breakfasts and lunches served through CACFP, which obviously during the school day, you can't do that because you have school lunch and school breakfast. So that means that those meals are being served on the weekends. And we've always toyed with the idea of doing kind of a addendum and showing that data. But yes, it's not easy to pull out the supper. So any supper or snack data you're seeing in the report could be those served on weekends, but we just know from our work that that's a pretty small amount of meals being served on weekends and holidays, even though it is a really great opportunity to do that. So does the after school program have to comply with the same lunch food rules and regulations? So it is a separate program, separate from NSLP. CACFP is separate from NSLP, so there are different components and paperwork. Sometimes they're even in a different state agency, but not always. So if you do have specific questions about the rules and regulations, I'm happy to connect. One thing I would flag is that there is guidance for schools who are doing CACFP that some components are streamlined to make it easier for them. State agencies recognize that schools are often experts in running these programs, and there have been steps taken over the last 10 years to really streamline some of that paperwork, reduce any kind of duplicative information that's being requested, because again, we know that schools are very familiar with running nutrition programs. So the last question I'll answer here, and this may be one that we'll have to come back to, is have you seen a correlation between states that have implemented universal school meals and the decline of sites' meals? Wondering if the meal eligibility forms not being turned in for meals has impacted the programs being area eligible. So we haven't heard this, and one thing I would flag is that even if states are universal or healthy school meals for all states, most likely they are still having to collect some kind of income information for other things like, state education funding or other funding sources that they tap into. So that data should still be there. We know across the board that last year, it just took families a while to, we have to fill out a form. We haven't had to do this in many years. So I think that could have also impacted that, but we don't see necessarily a correlation between those two things. All right. I don't see any new questions coming in. So we held to our deep dive 30 minutes. But if you do have any questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to me again, chayes@frac.org. We're very excited about this program, very excited to, again, re-energize and see what the issues are and how we can support. So feel free to reach out to me today, moving forward. And I just want to thank you all again for taking time out of your day to join us. And we hope to see you again on one of our webinars soon. So thank you so much.